First, a couple of housekeeping and other announcements. One, please, respect for our speakers, turn off your ringer on your phones or just put them on vibrate mode so that we don't get interrupted. I also wanted to make an announcement because of Steve Traylor will kill me if I don't remind you folks that we are going to be having a roundtable with Mobilitie at 10:45 in rooms A and B. So I know some of us are looking forward to that. And also we wanted to announce an INATOA webinar with representatives from Mobilitie, and that's going to take place on October 3rd. So see us if you want more information about that. With that, in my conversations with our distinguished panel here today, we decided that the best way to share information with the audience is to dispense with the PowerPoint presentations and have a conversation about 5G and why we're so interested in this and why we need this and what it means to us. So that's what we're going to try and do. Our speakers here, we have Jason Caliento with Mobilitie, and in the middle we have Zachary Champ with WIA, and in the back we have Brian Josef representing CTIA, the Wireless Association. So we really want to welcome our industry partners here today. I appreciate the time you took to come and talk with us. First of all, I wanted to frame this conversation before we get started. So if you allow me a couple of minutes to share some thoughts with you. There have been some recent and unfortunate comments emanating from certain quarters in Washington, D.C. to the effect that local governments are erecting roadblocks that will prevent their residents, businesses, and institutions from experiencing the benefits of 5G and other next-generation technologies. Speaking for myself, I find these allegations to be uninformed, misleading, unhelpful, and unsupported by the record. The truth is that local governments want the latest and greatest technologies. We all want to be smart cities, smart towns. We are major consumers of communication services and now understand how broadband, coupled with increased computing power, allow higher quality, more cost-effective public services and contribute to data-driven policy decisions. So we're very interested in learning how we can work together with our friends in the industry to accommodate their needs. Let's be clear, the reason why about 95% of households in the country have access to robust cable modem broadband services is because local communities insisted on full build-out of this infrastructure throughout our rights-of-way. Likewise, the record will show that local governments have worked well with wireless providers in the deployment of cellular 2G, 3G, 4G, LTE, and we expect to do it again here. Of course, there are always going to be some challenges and disagreements, but in the whole, we collaborated on bringing these incredible technologies to market, and they have fundamentally transformed the way we work, live, and play. I am confident that as we begin to dialogue, we will again find models and frameworks that address the needs of our industry partners to deploy 5G infrastructure without undue delays and in a cost-effective manner, while at the same time taking into account the challenges that local governments face to balance the competing needs for the use of scarce and valuable rights-of-way, preserving community aesthetics and public safety, to name a few. I think this is a great time for us to tone down some of the rhetoric and get down to the business of a frank dialogue to jointly figure out how to manage the unprecedented challenges of 5G deployment. I hope that this conversation is one small step in that direction. So with that, and thank you for indulging me for a minute, I wanted to start out at a really fundamental conceptual level and ask each of our panelists to tell us in their words, what is this 5G thing anyway? I've heard it referred to as an ecosystem of technologies. What do we mean by that? Jason, let's start with you.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Is that on?
No?
There you go.
How about now? Yes? No?
All
No? There? Okay. It's just proximity. Okay. So first of all, Tony, thank you. And in terms of, well, it's a conversation about 5G that we're going to have, but I think importantly what you just mentioned is important as well. We definitely look at, and I think from Mobility's perspective, we really appreciate the opportunity to be here with NATOA and with its members, because it is a dialogue. It is a partnership and a conversation about how you deploy infrastructure throughout their country. And so that's why we're here. And in terms of 5G, so I think what's interesting about 5G is we saw this with 4G and with LTE. It's this kind of snapshot of, it's almost like a marketing term. Hey, 5G, what is it? And the truth is, if you got 50 or 100 standards guys in the room right now, they don't agree on exactly what it is. And we work with a lot of those guys. But what they do agree is that, well, what I should say is they don't agree with exactly how it's going to work, but they do agree on what it is. And what it is really high bandwidth technology, meaning that things can happen really fast, with really low latency, and that can use multiple spectrums across bands. And so what that facilitates is just a really robust wireless experience. And we just came from CTIA and we met with the standards guys, and there's lots and lots of discussions about what that's going to be and what that looks like. And so to take it from kind of the standards level down to an applications level, what I think you're going to see is true wireless applications that hit at an enterprise level, allow businesses to do new things and invest in different ways of doing business. You're going to see entertainment options that we don't even have today, like virtual reality and enhanced reality, enhanced reality. You're going to see, I love the T-Mobile kind of ad for this here recently, where a cyclist riding with a set of glasses that allows him to have 360-degree vision of what's around him. And I think you're going to see really important public safety options as well, so or applications as well, such as a fire chief being able to see a scene from multiple camera angles and have a command center that's truly set up and be able to do that instantly upon arrival at the facility, because believe it or not, you either launch drones or there's remote cameras that are set up to be able to do those things. And same with police. I think with what we see with body cameras, being able to have real-time communications back with command center for incidents, I think it will be a public safety feature. So all of that application building gets built by that standard set, gets built out by all kinds of developers that are working on how do you apply this technology, and then by infrastructure and additional infrastructure.
We'll get into that.
Right, and so I think that we really are on the cusp of some really incredible things that we'll see as those standards come together, as applications which aren't fully developed yet get baked, and then as we densify networks to that end.
Zach, give us your thoughts.
Sure. And thank you, Tony and Steve and the leadership of NATOA for having us here. It's a privilege to speak to your members. We've had the opportunity to work with you all for the last couple of years on best practices for siting out of some of the FCC efforts there, and we look forward to continuing that dialogue, and so thank you for the opportunity to continue that today. I think Jason did a good job of setting up what 5G is as we see it today. I would just add to that point a little footnote is that I don't think we exactly know what it could be. So I think it's a opportunity for cities and towns and to get ready and allow for the bandwidth and capacity and number of users to access to create the applications of the future. It's not, it's maybe a coincidence that we're here in Austin where South by Southwest hosts the big tech summits every year and the president comes down now. And so we have app developers coming up with things that we couldn't have envisioned before. But there's a lot of things that communities can take advantage of with inventory management, with training, public safety. But I would just say, we don't know what augmented reality looks like. I know you have the Pokemon Go egg up there. That's one application of it, but there's going to be more there, and it's going to require sort of the streaming and bandwidth to do so. But I think when we look at 5G, I think it's iterative. So we've had the 2G, 3G, 4G. The elements that made 4G so successful are not going to go away. The macro cellular network provides a lot of the overlay and capacity and is especially important in rural communities and will play a critical role going forward. But there will be additional facilities coming forward in the thousands, tens of thousands, and not meaning to shock folks with that, but I think that's the reality of how folks are using cellular data today. And so it will require additional infrastructure and dialogues with you all about how to work with you in a responsible way that's congruent with your communities. And we want to make sure that we set each other up for success, because ultimately, it's regional, it's state by state,
Right.
It's also international. We want the U.S. to continue to lead in innovation. So 5G provides a foundation and framework to do that.
Brian?
Can folks hear me okay? Okay, great. So I also want to, first off, echo the thanks to NATOA, to Tony and Steve for including CTIA. We also have worked, I think, very well with NATOA and other organizations, particularly on these infrastructure and siting issues, and look forward to the continued work together. And really like to be out here having the dialogue, talking to you, hearing from you. Just to tack on, I think both of my co-panelists did an excellent job kind of giving an overview of 5G. I think maybe we will have an opportunity to kind of talk about specific 5G applications, both those that are being demoed today, deployed, or in trials. They touched on fleet management, but there are some things that the buzz is smart cities, but there really are some opportunities that are happening today, and that folks are just now envisioning for 5G, and I hope we have some time to talk about that.
Yeah, well, that's a good time for my next question, which was, can you take us kind of on a virtual reality tour of what a 5G enabled community looks like?
Well, and that's perfect. So first off, I want to, I guess, maybe draw out a point in terms of fundamentals when we're talking about both how the infrastructure is delivering the signals. Let's take a step back and talk about spectrum. And Jason touched on this. 5G, yes, is taking advantage of kind of ultra wide bandwidth new spectrum that's much higher up on the radio frequency scale than has previously been used. So we talk about high band spectrum, but really 5G services are going to be a mix of, and Tony, you mentioned this ecosystem. It's going to be both low, mid, and high band spectrum. And the way I think about it is low band spectrum, that's kind of what has been deployed for 2G and 3G and also being used for 4G technologies. That's kind of like the marathon runner. It can travel long distances. It can provide that coverage layer. that is going to still be a part of 5G services and technologies. It may not be the ultra-wide bandwidth. It may not be for downloading, for a fire chief arriving on scene, downloading HD blueprints of the building, that they need to go into. Mid-band spectrum, it's kind of like a jogger. It doesn't travel quite as far, but it can handle more capacity. And then high-band spectrum is like the Sprinter. So it goes really fast. It can carry a lot, but it doesn't go very far. Mm-hmm. And so that gets to some of the network densification issues. But what that means is, so you could have the coverage layer addressing fleet management, tracking. It need not be a lot of information, but it's got to be fairly ubiquitous. We're looking at 5G applications, and these are being deployed and trialed today in cities across the country, things like infrastructure monitoring. So water utilities. In Austin, a couple years ago, they lost 4.76 billion gallons of water. What if we were able to put in monitors, wireless monitors, to sense the leaks, to sense ruptures? We all know we can't flash cut to new water infrastructure, but if we can be smart about how we monitor some of this infrastructure and get on some of these cost-saving and conservation-saving applications, that's tremendous. We can also do this for electric utilities, smart lighting. That's something that a number of your cities are looking at, and connected lighting. So there are deployments now occurring where you can have integrated small cells or distributed antenna system technology in LED cost-saving lights. What if we can then have intelligence embedded there where a wireless emergency alert can go down to these light posts and issue and display an alert to warn your constituents? These are important applications. What if there's a shot spotter technology integrated, so a gunshot goes off, you can light up entire parts of the city. You can turn on high-def video cameras, and you can have your 911 centers, you can have your public safety authorities plugged into those. That's a tremendous empowerment, for your cities and for your constituents. So, I could go on and on, but there
Thanks.
are a number of.
I feel like I'm seeing it through my Oculus. Anybody else want to comment?
I'll take on to that. That when you think about wireless utility monitoring, which is now really probably commonplace in most of your jurisdictions at this point. 10 years ago, that was very new. And I think what Brian's describing is exactly right, but by doing that, communities and the utilities have invested really billions of dollars at this point for long-term cost savings for consumers, long-term cost savings for how we manage our grid. And so I think there's going to be these levels of industrial applications for 5G. The DOT yesterday, or I guess it was 2 days ago, issued its first set of guidelines for self-driving vehicles. And one of the requirements is, hey, these have to be connected in. Now, they didn't describe exactly how it has to be connected in or what that latency needs to be or all of those things, but as an add-on, if we're talking about a vehicle that's traveling 70 miles an hour, getting into an accident, being able to communicate back on that same highway to other vehicles, that's going to require millisecond type communications and the Sprinter type communications that Brian's describing. And that's, I think, where we're headed is towards the ability to facilitate those types of things and those types of applications. And in the opening executive summary of that policy statement, that's about saving 35,000 lives nationally. How do we do that? How do we make sure that highway fatalities drop? And so I think you're going to see real public safety, real industrial level applications, as well as entertainment and commercial.
Great. I'm going to ask my next question, Zachary. And you had a comment? Go ahead.
No.
I'm sorry. And I want to add that we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions. I promise to do that because I'm sure many of you are going to have better questions than I have, but I'm just starting it up for you. Zach, can you talk, and others also join in, can you kind of describe the anticipated arc of 5G from development, implementation, and maturation? When's it starting? When is it going to be a real part of our lives? What is that, a decade? Is that 5 years? What are we looking at? I mean, when are these standards going to be codified by the international bodies?
Sure, and it's already starting, I guess. So officially with sort of the standards development, I believe it's 2020 when that would be finalized. But the carriers have announced test beds and plans to begin launching next year. So I think you'll see, as with 4G rollout, like NFL-type cities, those sorts of markets may be some of the first launches of this technology. But it's an ongoing development. I think it's a process internationally that we are working on, and I think laying the fiber, getting the infrastructure sited, getting those sorts of conversations started now is what's going to be helpful. So the spectrum that would come online takes some time. So there's an auction that we're in the middle of currently. It'll take time for that auction to be provisioned, folks to move, the broadcasters, and then for devices to be updated. And the cycle time for device updates has actually lengthened in recent years. So it'll take a couple of years to get that spectrum out. But it's happening now, and I think we all have to be ready for that. There are new technologies that need to be anticipated, and there's an educational element that's I think required of all of us to understand how these technologies work with one another. And at the same point, I think the existing sort of platform that we have is helpful for the quick swap out of technologies. So the existing infrastructure that was available to swap out from 3G to 4G is already there. The FCC's been helpful, and we've worked with a number of communities on ensuring swift change out of antennas and base stations at those facilities, expansion when required to allow for more competitors, new carriers to come online. And so co-location is something that helps with that, and I think will be one of the first things folks look to as they build out that network. But it's coming, and I think 2020 is the official standards date, but you're going to see folks try and move faster than that when possible.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. You want to?
No, I think Zach is absolutely right. And I think, Jason, you mentioned, at the CTIA show, there was a lot of discussion of that. We're certainly hearing that. We have our members in the international bodies. It's important to remember this is an international effort, but yes, the U.S. is kind of leading that charge. The U.S. Led the globe in 4G deployment. We want to do the same in 5G. And I think there are certainly our member companies, but also policymakers across this country are saying, well, geez, Korea and Japan, they are trialing 5G technology, and they're looking to claim that mantle from the U.S. So I think you see, I know we're seeing a lot of discussion in the international context, and certainly in Washington D.C. about we want to maintain that global leadership. That's jobs, that's development, and that's a boost for the U.S. economy. But to put it in perspective, and I think this is fairly obvious, but I like numbers. The most recent estimates, and this is Cisco, and they've been doing this every year, and their estimates have generally been spot on, or perhaps even a little under the actual deployments. But they're saying that back last year there were 447 million connected devices in the U.S. In 4 years from now, by 2020, there will be 947 million mobile connected devices. So we're seeing more than 2 times growth there. We all talk about smartphones. The 5G discussion is M2M. It's machine-to-machine communications. It's the monitors. It's the sensors. It's the Internet of Things, smart appliances, and everything that we can imagine today and that we haven't yet imagined. And they're saying that mobile connected devices, the M2M modules are going to go from 75 million a year ago to over 513 million by 2020. So we're seeing twice the growth in mobile devices, mobile data devices growing over 6 times in just 5 years. So that gets to the need for denser networks and be able to, and more backhaul that Zach was mentioning, to be able to handle all of this. And I think there is a very serious concern that we're not going to be able to, that we need to do everything we can to keep up with the demand.
Yeah, and I'd add that 2020 isn't like an end zone. It's much more of a that's when we'll see some of the fruits of what we've already started working on. I mean, I think we'll see it before that, though, and I think it's important that when we're talking about 5G, it's not just something that comes down from on high, from and I'm not suggesting anybody here saying that, from standards boards, but really it's a reaction to how we interact now, how we communicate, how machines are being set up to communicate. We have to make it more efficient than it is today because of exactly what Brian's talking about. The way that we use our devices, the way that we communicate is each year becomes exponentially more data-driven. The way we consume data today versus even a year ago is unbelievable in terms of video. Anybody that hasn't watched Netflix on their phone is in the minority of smartphone users. And so we consume more video on our phones now today than any other form of data. And that didn't exist 3 years ago. It didn't exist 2 years ago. That's about a year old. So it's not, so I think what I want to make sure is that we're not saying, hey, in 2020, that's when this stuff needs to be done by. It's really right now, because everything that we do now sets up our ability to go execute on the promise of 5G when the standards are finished, and when we can actually roll out more of these types of applications.
Thanks. Let's turn now a little bit to we've alluded to it already, some discussion on some of the infrastructure requirements needed to make this work. I've heard estimates that we're looking at millions of antennas that are going to be needed, and that's daunting when you hear that. But tell us why that is, and also what are the size of these antennas? Are they like the size of a hockey puck or a bread basket, a drum? I mean, what can we expect?
How about I start?
Why do we need so many? Let's start there first.
So what we're really talking about when we're talking about densification of networks is additional points at which we can really do two things. One is split the spectrum, which is, I'm almost going to switch metaphors a little bit, which is kind of like real estate. But to be able to cut up that real estate into smaller sections so that we can continue to have high bandwidth, high speed applications running at the same time. So it's just physics. If we're all on the same cell and we're all trying to watch Netflix at the same time, we've all experienced this. If you've been in a stadium, it's a great example. We're not all going to be able to connect. We're not all going to have the same user experience. So we have to break that up. So we would put small cells. This room isn't the best example, but we would put multiple small cells to break that up into, for example, 4 different sections, so that we can all communicate and continue to use that same spectrum, but in different channels, and be able to have the same kind of user experience. So that's number one, is that we have to densify networks because of how we use the networks. The second is the frequencies that we're talking about are higher band frequencies, so they don't go as far, and so that actually makes it ideal for the Sprinter analogy. Makes it ideal for smaller, lower height applications than a traditional macro site, for example. So that's really kind of the drivers for densification. And so do I think we'll see, we start talking about millions, it's all kind of conjecture, but yes, tens of thousands of small cells throughout hundreds of thousands of small cell sites throughout the country, absolutely. I know what we're working on, and we're working on tens of thousands of small cells throughout the country for the express purpose of densifying our customers for the wireless carriers networks, so that they can create great user experiences and really help facilitate this next generation.
Can we talk a little bit more about kind of the line of sight properties and how is this different than, say, like 4G?
So I like to say, you know, the higher band spectrum, it goes meters, not miles. The lower band spectrum, what we have seen deployed to date, you know, that's what will travel, you know, far, provide that coverage area, coverage layer, provide that kind of ubiquitous connectivity. But you know, so what that means is, you know, we're going to see the densification happening where it makes most sense and where the population centers are. So that's you know, the urban areas and suburban areas, and that's you know, we're seeing these on utility poles, light poles, building sides, other locations. I mean, the good thing about these is they are smaller, lower power. I mean, the FCC has recognized the significantly more limited and minimal impact, you know, given the size of these facilities. And so, you know, that's all, you know, something important about keeping in mind how these are going to be sited. Now, the reality is as has been touched on, we need to have that dialogue. We need to, you know, understand, you know, what this means for your communities and your siting needs, and make sure that there are processes in place, that they're clear processes, but, you know, very important that they're flexible processes. So one thing that we know is 5 years in the wireless industry is an eternity. We are constantly innovating. We are coming up with new devices, new applications, new services in new spectrum. There is no single form factor. So we need to ensure that the processes in place, are sufficiently, flexible enough to accommodate the fact that we're going to have, different facilities for different services going forward. And that's a partnership. That's something that, we need to communicate to the communities, but we also need to make sure that there are ways to site this and these facilities. And I guess one point, and maybe we'll touch on this in a little more detail, but the process for siting macro facilities really doesn't apply very well to smaller facilities. They're just by nature of the different types of facilities, and then the timing. So I think we need to, I look forward to hearing feedback from those in the audience.
I think what it's a developing technology. There's small cells in the right of way can use the new spectrum, the sprinting spectrum for shorter distances, but they can also use traditional spectrum that's deployed today already. But I think, as an emerging technology, there's definitions that are yet to be sort of hammered out as to, what the difference is between a macro and a small cell. The FCC's helped with that. They've put forward a volumetric limit on the antenna sizes and the associated equipment, and so it's helped. But there's distinctions between macro, and that's, for those in the space, that's a familiar term, but that's the traditional tower. It's either a monopole or guide tower, normally around 200 feet in height, that can carry multiple tenants. And tenants would be different carriers, backhaul for point-to-point microwave, as well as other operations. But I think as small cells are developing and that conversation is going forward, there's a difference between the the applications for the macro and the small cell. And that's a conversation that is ripe for the community here. And so I think that's something that we're all working on, understanding how best to find things that are congruent, that allow for installation and allow for us to meet the 5G goals and the data demands that we need, allow for public safety, all those elements, but in a way that is respectful of local communities.
That's great. I'm not sure I heard about the sizes of these things, but I'm sure we'll get to that. I wanted, huh? Let's see if anybody can venture an estimate on that, and also, but I also wanted to talk about with this densification and with so many receiving and transmitting devices in our communities, what's the potential for interference?
So nobody is more interested in solving interference than certainly the wireless carriers. So and so a lot of what you see in the 5G even in the 4G standards. I'm not a standards guy, but I can tell you that OFDM was set up really to make sure that which is what the platform is for all of 4G, was really set up to cure interference. So I think you're going to see a huge focus on that. I don't think it's going to be a major factor. And similar to interference, security is another thing that will be huge as part of the standards related to 5G, because you're going to see things as we become more wireless dependent, more smartphone dependent. I think you're going to, there's certainly an appreciation of how secure those networks need to be to make sure that it goes really well. So I don't think anybody's more focused on that than the standards boards and the carriers to make sure there is not interference.
Great, thanks, Jason.
Yeah,
Anybody else want to
I
contribute?
would just add in, I completely agree with Jason, and that is what the standards bodies are keenly sensitive to and making sure to address. A lot of this also has been addressed at the FCC in the rulemakings to say, all right, is this spectrum usable for commercial mobile wireless services? Some had been used for fixed wireless. Some had been used by other providers, some satellite, some government agencies. The reality is there's no kind of, we call it greenfield spectrum. There's no unused spectrum sitting on the shelf today. So that's for our complexities, not yours. That's making it more and more difficult to get access to spectrum to meet the demands of our wireless subscribers and to unleash these new applications and services that we've been talking about. But part of that is carefully managed in the rulemaking process of power levels and the like to make sure that there isn't the interference potential. So.
Anybody else, one last chance on the potential sizes of some of these antennas?
Sure. I'll just offer up that it's physics. All of these frequencies literally have a wavelength. So the antenna is in conformity with what can effectively transmit that wavelength. So when you're talking about it's somewhat flipped, but when you're talking about the lower frequency bands, those are a larger wavelength, so the antennas are bigger. And then you get down to higher wavelength, those antennas become smaller. And when you get into
I'm glad to hear they're becoming smaller.
well, when you get into millimeter wavelength, you're talking about smaller antennas. So, but as Brian said, there isn't a single form factor. It's really about how and then we don't want all kinds of antennas. So the irony is you don't necessarily want antennas that can only do one of those. So sometimes it's a single antenna that can do all three, and so and so you get into what's the form factor that can do that. So I think again, nobody's more interested in doing this cost effectively than certainly the wireless carriers and infrastructure providers around the country. So but it's not. It's literally physically related. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank
you. You guys agree?
Yeah, I'd agree on the antennas aspect. I think we would just say that we'd look to the existing deployments within the right of way and look for something that's in keeping with that sort of size as far as the structure that the antennas are attached to. And so that's something we're looking at, something we've heard from communities across the country that we don't want elements there that are beyond the scope of the planned lighting fixtures and the elements that you've worked on to protect. We have members that have deployed in New Orleans, which is a historic district. They have a DAS system in downtown New Orleans, and that's it's within the features there. The light standards there are something that anyone visiting New Orleans would understand. They've got the cast iron and whatnot, and we've been able to, our members have been able to put that within there, and it's something that fits in with the aesthetics and allows for revelers to Snapchat and post things during their partying, but it doesn't distract from sort of the aesthetics of that community.
Great.
So are you looking at putting these on existing structures that are already in the right of way, or putting your own facility in the right of way to hold that?
I think, I can't speak for each of our members, but I think we'd look to use existing infrastructure when it's available and it provides the right propagation, it gets the right amount of consumers, but then add new installations in the right of way, but in a way that's congruent with what's already there. So if you have 45-foot light poles there, I would look to something similar to that.
Well, that was going to be my next question. What's the average height of these antennas?
For the ones that we've, yeah.
Yeah. Don't mean to interrupt, but can you hold
Yeah.
your questions until, we're going to have time for audience questions. But, I want to talk a little bit about some of the backhaul needs for this. Is it fiber, microwave, and to what extent does the FCC's proposed changes to business data services, where does that come in? Anybody?
So backhaul is critical. I mean, it's one of the things that we see with using and stretching spectrum to the extent we can with cell splitting, which Jason mentioned, is that the quicker you can get the user off the larger network and backhaul to the data centers, the more users can be supported. So backhaul requires different systems. You can have fiber backhaul. You can have microwave backhaul, which is actually line of sight, point-to-point communications. So you can have those big drum dishes that you see on some rooftops or on towers are microwave backhaul. There's a new sort of term developing called front haul, which brings fiber to the tower. So there's that element, but there's also, depending on the application, unlicensed spectrum's being used quite a bit. So a lot of your phones have updates now to start a call on Wi-Fi, then move to LTE, and then back to Wi-Fi, and that helps alleviate congestion there. But the backhaul requires robust fiber networks, and when fiber is unavailable, it would require a build out. But in some applications, microwave can help as well.
Yeah,
And-
especially when it's not cost effective. So I mean, I think the backhaul is everything. Backhaul in this equation for 5G is fundamentally critical. One of the as Mobilitie, we're a utility, and we're a CLEC or kind of similar entity in all 50 states with the because backhaul is so critical. And so to echo Zach's comments, I mean, I think you're going to see a wider range of backhaul used, including non-line of sight microwave, which you're going to see other types of alternative backhaul used, which includes licensed spectrum, because this becomes so critical of how do you get, while that data is so important, that last connection with a device is so important, getting that all the way back, and that's what backhaul is, that's what gets it back to the internet, getting everything back to the internet where it can connect in is everything in this. And so I think you're going to, and that's kind of the foundation of the networks that we work on, is how do you make sure that that connection all the way back to the internet is taken care of?
And,
Sorry.
and I'd agree with Zach and Jason, and just add that, there are other spectrum bands and types of services that folks are looking at for the backhaul. Certainly microwave, but also other new bands for fixed wireless, some existing bands that may be authorized for fixed wireless, but it hasn't really been deployed and utilized in the networks the way we're talking about for backhaul. But absolutely, backhaul is going to be is a critical component. So.
Great. One other question. Do you anticipate perhaps working with lots of our community members here at NATOA have extensive fiber facilities in their communities? Do you see opportunities for working with some of these local communities to use those assets for your backhaul needs?
I think,
Sorry, go
I don't know, I think you look at the what's available, you look at sort of, is it in the right places? And so I think it's an all options on the table sort of element, but there's still not enough out there, so folks are required to build where it's not available. But any person, any company putting out a search ring and looking for where coverage is needed would look to see what's already there.
Yeah, I agree.
I just got a couple of more questions before I'll turn it over to the audience. Let's spend a little time talking about how we can work together as we move forward with this somewhat unprecedented, I think, deployment challenge. As you go around the country and working with local communities, what has worked? I mean, what has worked? I could give examples of some, productive engagements with local communities. And then on the flip side, let's talk a little bit about what's not working or what could be improved. Let's start from the end.
So, I touched on this earlier. I think, those communities that have flexible policies in place and procedures, shot clocks certainly help. I'm a firm believer in, nothing focuses an effort like a deadline, and that, goes both ways. I think there's certainly an obligation on the applicant to make sure that their application is complete, that they've provided, all of the relevant information up front. But then there's also an obligation that be clearly communicated. Electronically is ideal. Having some of the procedures in place that yield expedited action is critical. I think the shot clocks have provided certainty and on both sides, and that's been a good thing. I also recognize that education, understanding kind of what the applicant is looking to put in your rights of way, that is something that the applicant needs to bear, needs to clearly communicate what they're putting in, how, and what the impact is. But what I will say is moratoria don't work well. The notion of this is new, we're not familiar with it, so we're going to stop processing of applications, that does raise concerns for our members. And so want to hear from you, what information you need to make sure that we don't go down the path of what doesn't work, but we have an understanding of what works on your end and what you need from applicants.
I think Brian touched on a lot of it. I think we'd support shot clocks as well. I think the sooner we can get to a yes, no, or otherwise, the better. The more that's upfront in terms of clarity of expectations from both sides is helpful. A lot of our members do sort of pre-planning visits to work with the community in advance. That we found that has been helpful in many instances. And then also, as we're entering into a new sort of realm, is ensuring that there's a point of contact that's well known within each city. When you're working in the right of way versus outside the right of way, different entities are invoked. So is it the PUC? Is it a siting council? How do those all work together? And some of these are state level sort of questions. But to the extent we know who to go to, and that person has sort of a chain of command to get to an answer and an escalated review process, the quicker we can get these items deployed and folks can get back to work on other projects, because the scale of this could be quite large depending on the city, and so we know everyone's sort of multitasking and doing other projects, and to the extent this is something that's familiar and it's been done before, it should be sort of a repetitive sort of process. But I think that's sort of the element, and to the extent we can continue to have educational dialogues, let you know sort of what's coming in terms of technology and uses, the better armed local communities could be as to what to expect and how we can work together.
So let me say first, there is phenomenal work going on with the cities across the country. We're engaged, I'd say at this point, with about 2,800 separate jurisdictions, and we see phenomenal work. New York, LA, Chicago have robust processes around this where we have teams that are working every day, and we're deploying every day in all three of those cities as examples. Houston is another example where fantastic work. Indianapolis has been terrific, and I don't mean to exclude, at my own risk of saying that. And then there's hundreds of others, and I would agree with the comments. It's a clear champion has made all the difference. Who in the community is the champion of deployment of this type of infrastructure? It's huge. Sometimes it takes us a long time to identify that person. Sometimes they exist, sometimes they don't. And so having a very clear champion, having a process that is effective for both you and the developers, I think is really important, where it's reasonable. And three, understanding kind of the mutual constraints in this is really important. So we, for example, as a developer of lots of different infrastructure, but of small cells, what we see most frequently is design iterations which may or may not have an impact on the technical performance, and so solving those types of things really quickly is important, as well as, and then the last thing I'd add is reasonable and non-prejudicial agreements. So how we access the right-of-way, for example, as a utility, needs to be the same as how other utilities enter the right-of-way. And so making sure that we've got some parity in those terms and parity in the process and those types of things is really important. And when we see that, it's terrific, and we're moving really quickly. I'll say this as well. What is not working, and I love Austin. I love the city of Austin, but I'd have no problem if the mayor was here, because I've said this to him before, that their current policy around small cell deployments, for example, is totally inadequate for what they're trying to provide for South by Southwest, and we're seeing cities fall behind in this. And it's not just because we want to roll out networks. It's also significant investment, private investment in infrastructure in the communities that drive both economic growth and educational opportunities. And so we do see cities that fall behind, and there's very active wireless carrier conversation going with the city of Austin right now, because because we're here. I don't have any problem bringing it up. They're falling behind their sister cities in San Antonio and Houston.
I'm obviously not going to speak for the city of Austin, but I think it's clear that communities are different, and they have different cultures, different histories, different sense of aesthetics, and I think part of this dialogue and engagement that we're trying to create is finding how to strike the right balance with all of these considerations that we need to take into account. I'm going to ask my last question. I'm going to turn it over to our audience. Can we just spend a few minutes talking about maybe some future creative approaches that could minimize the impacts on our crowded rights of way? Let's take, for example, is there something that developers can be doing to integrate some of this small cell technology in the design and planning phase for new construction? Something like that.
I mean, I'll speak to I think the question kind of get pointed to Zach earlier. We attach to existing infrastructure significantly, where we can use investor-owned utility poles, where we can use city-owned light poles, and we work really closely, and the vast majority of our agreements are to do those types of things. Where that doesn't work because it doesn't solve the either the backhaul or the end wireless problem that our customers have, that's where we then look to put something new in the right of way. If we can solve it at the right height and with an existing piece of infrastructure, we'll solve it that way. And if we can't, that's where new infrastructure gets proposed. And I think that's reasonable and what kind of as a body folks should expect. But certainly in terms of integrating this into existing infrastructure, we'll pay significant license fees every year to cities, which we welcome, and significant license fees or franchise fees to tariffs to other investor-owned utilities for exactly that purpose.
Yeah,
Anybody else?
Sure. I think there's a number of ways that I think we can address this in a planning method. There's a panel later this afternoon on dig once, touch once, site once. Has to do with when you're digging up conduit or the right of way, that could be an opportunity to lay fiber. Touch once where you're adjusting facilities on a pole, everyone goes out there at the same time, or there's a schedule there, which can make it a little bit quicker for folks. There's other conversations that have begun. I think you take it from the LEED certification for green buildings, where if wireless were considered, cellular wireless were considered in a building, and it was built in there, you'd have better coverage indoors. So rather than pointing inside, you could have the coverage within the building. And there's some developers, commercial developers, that are looking to lay the correct conduit and IT closets to support that, as well as supporting rooftop systems on those buildings. But I think, it's you look to what's existing. In some cases, you need to replace a pole or put a new pole in the right of way. The antennas we're putting up, you have to go through the whole wind loading and structural analysis, and they might need an extension. And so sometimes our community is replacing poles for another entity, so they can have the coverage in the right place. And so we'll pretty much purchase a pole for a utility company. But I think it's going to take sort of all elements of the toolbox to consider how folks are using it and where it is. I think Jason touched on it.
We'll need to be creative. Brian?
Yeah, and I don't want to repeat. I agree with Zach and Jason. I think the ability to locate or co-locate on existing structures, that's a first choice. There needs to be flexibility for kind of an array of options where that's not possible. But Jason touched on kind of the fees issue, and I want to put it in context a little more. So yes, there are kind of the permitting or franchise fees at the local level. carriers are spending billions of dollars, billions with a B, for the right to use the spectrum. That's before they've built out a single facility for that spectrum. So then, they're spending, on average, $31 to $33 billion a year every year for the last several years in this deployment, and now the FCC is proposing, well, we'll give you a license term, but if you don't build out within 5 years, others get to start using your spectrum. So these are pressures, again, not that you need to worry about, but so you have a perspective of the licensee, of the wireless carriers. That's why they want to build out as quickly as possible. The reality is they have, buckets of, of dollars that they can spend, in certain regions, and if they sense delay or an inability to complete a build, they're forced to move somewhere else. They need, as investor-owned companies, they need to make a return on those investments. And we think that there's a path forward doing this cooperatively. But just that's when you hear the kind of sense of urgency from the industry of building out and deploying, these are some of the pressures that you may not always see, but that they are very cognizant of.
Well put. And at dinner last night, admittedly, after a couple of glasses of wine, we were wondering whether or not we could use solar-powered drones and mount antennas there, but that's not a real question.
So, well, actually, so Facebook is looking at that solar-powered drone. Now they're
Great.
doing that in Africa at the moment, and they're testing, but not so far-fetched. It's not purely science fiction.
All right, that's for another day. But now this is the point where I want to turn it over to our audience for questions. If you want to step up to the mic and let us know who you are and where you're from.
Good morning. My name is Dan Cohen. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I want to thank you all for coming in this morning. And certainly on the technology side, what I'm hearing is that what 5G will provide is a kind of ubiquitous digital world, and I think everybody in this room welcomes that. I guess what I'd like to maybe provide is a little bit of unsolicited advice when it comes to local governments. I was a municipal official for 12 years and a lawyer representing municipalities for 18 years. And I think the way I would probably encapsulate it in terms of how municipalities want to work with the industry is that they want transparency, they want accuracy, they want collaboration. And with all due respect, Mr. Caliento, with mobility, at least in terms of our experience with mobility, we have not received that. So, and I'll give you just one small example. A 120-foot tower, 120-foot, excuse me, a pole in the public rights of way is not a small cell. It's just not. It's a tower, and it needs to be treated as a tower. So that's just one small example. And what I would recommend is that with all the money that's being invested and appreciated in the infrastructure, that you invest a little bit more time in relationships with local governments, large local governments and small local governments all over the country, because that's not happening right now. Again, from my perspective and where we operate. So I think that if, I'm just using mobility as an example, if you were to put a little bit more time, a little bit more money into, and I'm not even talking about fees, this is completely separate from fees, to providing accurate information, doing it in a transparent way, and developing relationships with local governments, I think that will work to the benefit of mobility and also to local governments. And to be honest, that has not happened yet. So forgive the unsolicited advice,
No,
but
it's okay, and it was Dan, right?
Yes.
Dan, thanks. So we'll own our mistakes, and we'll be transparent on exactly what we're doing. I think at times finding the right. So the counter argument I would make, not counter argument, but the counterpoint I would make is what I said earlier is sometimes it's tough to find that champion, and so I think we would ask for the same, that transparency on who is it that we should be working with, because at times that gets difficult. We'll own our mistakes. We'll come and we'll make sure that we have a meeting with the city of Pittsburgh to make sure, because I know we just signed our Decane Power and Light agreement here recently, and are looking forward to working in Pittsburgh in a large way. So, I mean, I think what we want to do is make sure that we've invested significantly in folks that are more local than rather than kind of headquarter based, so that we can do that. But agreed completely. Kind of the accuracy side of this should be expected. We should be able to give you very clear guidance on exactly what we're doing and where, and what the physical components are. And I do want to address, we're not just building small cells. In large parts, we're building transport networks to allow for cost-effective backhaul that I mentioned, and using microwave as opposed to digging up significant miles of highway and roads for fiber networks. And so you're going to see what we think is a more cost-effective way to deploy. And we're happy to be, that's why we're here. We want to be transparent on what we're doing and help educate all the communities on what we're doing and why we think it's a really cost-effective way, as well as a way to partner with communities to get it done.
Thank you.
Yep. And
Next.
And so Joe Sutton is going to get your name and number, and we'll go from there.
Pam Berrien, Eugene, Oregon. I think we're working pretty well with Mobility, and the other carriers coming in have for decades. We have a pretty tough electorate in terms of the public interest principles, especially the right-of-way. So there really are two questions we're dealing with, and I think we're dealing with Mobility just fine right now as it's beginning to meet with Public Works and stuff. One is we have over 35 square miles of land in our city, and I don't know why the providers keep clustering in our rights-of-way. We have a very good 20-year-old, and the providers seem to like our land use cell tower zoning and site review ordinance, which does allow the tall towers. And we have streamlined tower siting processes. Been that way for over 20 years, very simple, and yet they keep saying, well, no, we're choosing the rights of way, and I still don't quite get, I haven't gotten a clear answer as to why you need to cluster in the right of way when we have these great streamlined tower zoning laws. For that. The second is about the co-location fees. When you are willing to co-locate on a street light or a traffic signal that the city owns. For decades, we've had contracts that are roughly averaging $1,200 a month for each attachment. But all of a sudden, even though you're spending more billions, but you also spent billions 20 years ago and 10 years ago, and we're still getting those fees today, $1,200 or $1,500 a month per attachment. I don't get why now the small cells want to lock up a pole, the property, but they don't want to pay any more than $2,000 or $3,000 a year. So if you could answer those two questions, bye.
Is that directed at anyone in particular, or anyone?
So why don't we have a separate conversation with Eugene to do that? But well, I don't know the details of the specific zoning in.
The association should jump in because you're not the only provider.
Right. Well, so I don't know the specifics on the zoning code. We've got folks, so we can certainly sit down and have a conversation with you about that. In terms of the fees for the light pole attachments, it's simple economics. These have to be at rates that would attract us to use city-owned infrastructure. At $1,200 per month, we're not going to deploy small cells on city-owned infrastructure. It doesn't make any financial sense at all, not just for us, but for the wireless carriers. So I think what you're going to see is a market rate that emerges for small cells. I think we've got a good sense of it. When we're using city-owned infrastructure, that needs to be in line with the tariff rates that we pay to investor-owned utilities. And so we're talking about sub $100 per month is where I think that small cell market is. And when you think about densifying the networks across country and how capital intensive that is and what the OpEx is to that, it needs to be in line with what the city's costs are with administering those rights away.
And I mean, I would just add, to your point on the utility poles. I mean, those are regulated rates, and our associations, worked to clarify what was really already, set in a statute by Congress that said, telecommunications carriers, are entitled to attach to utility poles at these rates, and these are certainly well south of $100. They're more like 15 to 30 per pole, and there's a reason for that. It was maximizing and leveraging the utility poles that are out there. And then, Congress's interest, national interest in, ensuring deployment. And this is available, as you all know, to cable operators and other, communications providers. But we made sure that, and the FCC agreed and made explicit that wireless attachers, have rights to access those poles and the pole tops. We viewed that as, as a good thing, leveraging what is already there and in the ground. As we touched on, it may not always be available in terms of where the network needs to be deployed and how, but certainly an option we thought made a lot of sense for both your communities and your constituents, but also wireless carriers.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Kevin Kapp with Connected Nation Exchange. We help governments get their vertical assets ready for wireless, and one of the biggest concerns we hear is about the visual impact of the large equipment on the poles. So not always so much worried about the antenna, but the large, they call them refrigerators they see. Since this is supposed to be about 5G, is there anything coming up with 5G that'll shrink that or make that more amenable, that equipment that has to run the antennas?
Sorry. It depends, I guess, what spectrum you're using and how you're running it. So I think depending on the range and propagation, size can be adjusted. There's also considerations for battery backup. So at the large traditional sites, there's often generators, but if you're on a small cell, you need actual batteries. So depending if that's a requirement or if that's what's put out there, that would be an attachment. There's also heat dissipation, so you would need either cooling or the fins to help dissipate heat. But I think these things, again, depending on what spectrum is being used, that dictates some of the size. Sometimes there's elements on the pole that our industry doesn't control, so we have to buy power from the electric companies as well, and they may require a metering box. So what you see there may not even be ours, but a requirement from us. And then we also look to see where else this can be placed. Sometimes it's on something called street furniture, or sometimes we can have it remoted or in an adjoining building or something like that. So it's really, I think, application dependent on sizing, but we've seen some changes there.
And I would agree with that. It's dependent on how many antennas, what spectrum those antennas are operating in, and all that. But I wish this is one of the downsides. I think we all agreed that not boring you with a death by PowerPoint presentation would be in your interest. But I have a great slide with a picture of the city of Los Angeles has deployed, so not a trial, but kind of, I guess, an initial deployment of 100 LED Philips streetlights. So super energy conserving, and they have integrated in it an Ericsson small cell. And it's literally, it's the pole going up, and it's, you know, slightly wider in diameter where there's the cell. This isn't an endorsement of one particular technology. It's just an example of, you know, this is happening. It's happening in a way that, you know, I think looks very aesthetically, you know, sensitive and pleasing, and so there are, Kevin, there are those types of kind of applications. It's not everything, but the possibilities are there.
Hi, I'm Adam Bender with ComDaily. I'm just curious about about how many communities is industry actually having major problems with siting small cells at this point? How big of a problem is it?
It's not the majority. It's distinct communities where it may be a communication issue. It's also netting out, as the individual from Eugene mentioned. It's understanding how traditional sort of siting fees work with a new technology. So it's getting a communication going around that. I couldn't put an actual number on that for you, Adam. I'd be happy to share something with
But
you.
it's the great minority.
It's
It's
a great
another way of
minority,
saying
yeah.
it, right?
Let Zachary see it, the minority, so Adam, like you, Tony.
No, we enjoy a wonderful dialogue with the NATOA community. As I mentioned at the front, we were privileged to work with your membership on best practices for siting developments and for the co-location 6409A implementation. We hope to work on sort of best practices and checklists in the future as we look to new technologies. So you know, we appreciate your willingness to work with us. I brought my NATOA survival kit here. I don't think I'll need it. But it's really a small minority, and I think a lot of that comes from education.
Great. Steve, it's 10:15. I was going to ask, we have more questions, and if our panelists don't mind staying a few extra minutes so we can get the rest of the questions in. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Larry?
I'm Larry Dunbar from Ellensburg, Washington State. Our city owns and operates an electrical distribution utility, and my question for the panel is are you proposing to put your small cells in the communication zone on utility poles or in the power zone on utility poles? And I would imagine you need a power supply for each of your devices. And then my last question is just kind of try to get an idea of how common your devices are. If you have a distribution system with 1,000 utility poles in it, how many of those 1,000 utility poles do you need to attach to?
Mm-hmm. So we were, WIA was happy to be a party in Washington State before the PUC for investor-owned infrastructure, and we helped to provide clarity on rates and attachments for investor-owned utilities. As far as where we attach, depending on, again, the propagation of who we're trying to reach and what spectrum we're using, that'll depend where we would locate. Traditionally, we've looked to pole tops. It's the highest available space. It has the greatest ability to reach the most folks. So that's where we'd be looking, and that is in the communications space under the FCC and under the FCC regulations and under new Washington State regulations, at least for investor-owned utilities. There's a calculation there. The other part of your question is as far as how many of the poles would be used. I hate to say it, but it depends. It depends if they're downtown. Is it in a place of large commerce? Does an existing macro site not reach the folks that are there? Does everyone pour out of their office building for lunch at a certain time, and you need a small cell there? So it really depends on the application there. But for traditional DAS, it wouldn't be each one next to each other. It may be every other pole, something like that. But again, different carriers have different.
With attaching in the power zone, do you have qualified electrical workers to go into that zone on our
That's the
poles?
second question, Larry, but that's okay.
We would.
Or would you rely on the
right.
electric utility?
We would propose, I think, sort of engaging in an additional conversation about sharing a list of qualified electrical workers. Yeah. So the same folks that would work on utility poles for the power companies we'd select folks from that list.
That's quite untraditional for a power company to let anyone in their power zone.
It is, but the demand is not is unrelenting. Folks need this, and I think there's a way to do it safely.
Thank you.
Mitzi?
Hi there. Mitzi Herrera from Montgomery County, Maryland, adjacent to Washington, D.C. I want to echo the sentiments that I know that the city of Austin is actually working on a new small cell policy. We have been working on drafting some new legislation to promote that, but that a 30-foot pole, which may be a small cell, is not the same as 120. And that there has been a big push to, instead of working together, there seems to be a lot of how can we skirt the rules. So it would be helpful if we could focus the efforts on how to draft policies for things that were never thought of when these things were first put in there. But my question is, you mentioned about wanting to have attachment rates similar to investor-owned pole utility rates. I'm curious, do you know what the range or the average rates that private providers such as Crown Castle or American Tower will charge? Are those significantly more than the utility or the investor-owned pole attachment rates, and have any of your members agreed to pay those higher fees?
Are you? Go ahead.
So, I'm sorry, I missed your first name.
Mitzi.
Mitzi. So in terms of, so let me say this. Our teams are set up to come in and work with your communities. If we're not doing that well, as Dan referenced, then I'll take responsibility for that and make sure that our teams are coached up and that we're doing that well. We are in no way trying to skirt any rules. This is new in many cases, and we definitely are starting with a position of how we want to do it. But that said, it'll be a conversation with the municipality. We're not trying to skirt any rules or regulations, but we will work with you to define, in many cases, what we're finding in some communities, we're helping to define what those new rules and regulations need to be. So please don't take it as we're trying to skirt it as much as, hey, we've got a position on how we think this works well. Let's work together to get there. And if we're not doing that well, I'll take responsibility for that, and I'll make sure that our team is working with you on that.
I was going to say, just want to add, if you have specific questions for mobility, don't forget that at 10:45, we're going to be having a round table. But sorry to interject.
Right. In terms of your second question, I'm not sure I completely caught the question. I think what you're asking is if.
Well, so, roughly what you said, 15 to 30 bucks a year is what an investor-owned utility may charge for their poles. What I'm asking you is, when you go on American Tower or Crown Castle site, do you pay more than that?
So I don't locate on Crown or American Tower sites. So if a wireless carrier chose to do that, yeah, I think it's the difference between, yeah, I think there's for a wireless carrier, the question is, can I locate on a public right-of-way versus a Crown or American Tower site? That's your question?
Let's be clear. I think there's a difference between if you're just in the right-of-way versus you're leveraging property, right? You seem to imply that if you had street lights, if you have other kinds of poles there, that you should have fees that are the same as investor-owned utilities. So we're trying to get a sense of, do you charge, if other people are on your sites, something that's limited to that? Are there other things that are not owned by municipalities or the investor-owned utilities that it's that same charge? Is that what we're all agreeing to? Or are we saying, no, if it's an investor-owned utility or municipality, it should have a lower rate than a private commercial carrier or speculative tower builder?
Yeah, so I'll defer. So I'll defer to WIA on that.
Yeah, so there's the right-of-way, as we all know, is for the public good and use there. So there's fees regarding access to that. There's permitting fees and all that. But if an infrastructure provider is building in the right-of-way, there are maintenance aspects that they would incur. So I don't know my members' individual rates for a DAS deployment in the right-of-way or a small cell deployment. I will say there's some elements of technology that differ there. If you're a DAS, which is distributed antenna system, it can be multi-carrier, multi-tenant. So I can put a CAN on the top of a telephone pole, your telephone pole, or a utilities, and I can have multiple carriers within that. So the expenses are kind of distributed that way. So I can have AT&T, Verizon, all on the same structure. Small cell, it's getting there, but it's not multi-carrier right now. So there's be a different economics there. And then there's also, when you're building a new structure in the right-of-way, there's architectural fees and things like that. But I apologize, I can't speak specifically to sort of the business model on actual numbers for what those contracts look like. I think it's different in each community, but I'd have to check with members on that.
Are you asking why you should let a utility pole be placed in the right-of-way that's not subject to 224 rules? So if they want to put up a pole, you regulate the rates for the use of the pole just the way you do for any other utility pole. So if AT&T wants to use it, they pay more than they would pay if they had a small cell to a Petco pole, for example.
Well, what I'm just overall saying is, I think we should just have it's like, I don't think we should have one set of rules that applies for localities. It's limited to cost. It should be the same as the pole rates. And yet, if it's a private carrier, a telecom carrier, all these other factors that come in, it's an engineering thing, it applies. And I guess there's a line. What I would just say is that, particularly in communities where you have more dense populations, we put a lot of investment into schools, libraries, fire services, and other things that support a reason why people live in an environment that makes it cost effective for you to build out, because they're not spaced out. And that is often why we want more than the cost of just maintaining the road to be part of the rent for that, because we can call it free Wi-Fi, we can call it free adoption, all those things, but ultimately it costs money, and that's how we pay for things. So.
Okay. Point well made, Mitzi. We're almost out of time. We're really pressing against time, so I'm going to ask that your question is 30 seconds. The response is 1 minute for each of you.
Okay. Barbara Thornton, San Rafael, California. And my question is, with the 5G, it sounds like standards aren't going to be here till about 2020. So there's time here that we have to be able to plan and let cities and local governments understand what the technology is, what types of equipment you're going to be placing, what the requirements are going to be, so that we can work on our processes, on our regulations jointly to be able to be ready for this. Because to date, people say 5G is coming, it's here now, and you got to act immediately. And it sounds to me like we have some opportunity to do some intelligent planning and working together. Versus in some of the other things to date, when they first are introduced, we don't know what it is. And that's part of what the delay and the misunderstandings is.
But Barbara, what I'd add is that to be 5G ready, though, there's work that we understand today, and that there are standards around today, and that there's applications for today. And so please don't take this as, hey, we've got 4 years to do it. I don't know offhand if we have, for example, work going in San Rafael, but we have work going all over California. And it's to get ready for this. It's to make sure that we've got the densification and optimization of these networks ready to go. So I hear your comments, and I would just add, hey, there's work today, though, that needs to get done to
I
do it
understand
well.
that. I've been an outside plan engineer.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but even the stuff that needs to be done ahead of time to get ready, just the better understanding that we know what's coming and can plan for that and be ready for it, I think will help overall.
Perfect.
Thank you. Jerry, last question.
Sure. First of all, Jason, really, thank you very much for being here. From the outside, let me reaffirm to you that your changes are helping. I'm negotiating with you in 3 different places. The new team you have in Atlanta, or the Georgia area, it's making a lot of sense. If you could start by eliminating the 120-foot request in the first letter, I think you would reduce stomach acids enormously. So think about that. Maybe it's up to or whatever you have to do.
We want to be transparent.
Well, except that you haven't asked for 120 foot anywhere. But Brian, I want to thank you for your quote that the U.S. was the envy of the world in its deployment of 4G. We were your partners in achieving that, and we don't hear you say that very often. We hear about the minority. We don't hear about all of us being your partner in rolling out 1, 2, 3, and 4G, and why we wouldn't do that for 5.
And so let me explicitly say on the record, we agree and we appreciate the partnership and look forward to continuing that.
And then I'm going to go back to Tony's question for the third time, and maybe I'll offer the answer, and that is size. And I think that the reason nobody can answer size is because you were successful with 6409A, so that size is always going to be no less than 10 by 6. And so when you talk about the cosmetically invisible application in New Orleans, I can't guarantee that I'm going to have that cosmetically invisible application, because under 6409, it can go 10 feet up and 6 feet out. And, you know, again, I congratulate you on your victory, but I think you've got to live with that victory now, because an awful lot of us have to really think through how we incorporate and how we protect ourselves, so that when we spend all that money on that terrific light fixture in New Orleans, that it stays that way. Thanks for being here.
I guess it does matter.
Thanks.
Well, I think we're out of time, and thank you, Jerry, for the last question. And I really want to express, again, my appreciation for these three gentlemen from the industry to come here and talk to us about 5G and its challenges, and let's give them a big hand of applause, please. Thanks so much.